Okay. Yeah, welcome everybody to the second meetup of the Product Engineers community. Today we have two special guests. So we have Michele Sollecito, who is working as a engineering manager for Meta. He has around 15 years of experience between management, hands-on work, and software architecture. And yeah, he has a lot of knowledge about system thinking. So we're looking forward to hear more about that from him. And then we have Luis Rodriguez, who works as a product engineer at New Store. Um, sorry. All right. So first of all, before getting into it, I'd like to ask to whoever is listening, um, what is, in your opinion, system thinking in one sentence? Just write it in the chat. I'll give you a few seconds. So Martin says, thinking model of seeing the whole rather than the parts. Okay, if you come up with something, I'll read it later. So yeah, that's probably one of the way to saying it. And question now to the guests. So have you ever encountered a situation where a small change created like a ripple effect, that kind of created some big change, a bit like, the famous butterfly effect. That's when I hear system thinking, I think about the butterfly effect. Have you ever, in your experience, that have happened? Do you have any story to share about it? I don't know, Michele, if you want to start.
Sure. First of all, thanks for having me. Pleasure seeing you guys again. And yeah, it is a topic that I really like talking about. Where I'm an expert or not is a different story. And yeah, I like Martin's definition, right? It's essentially like system thinking to me. It's a little bit like a lens where it kind of like begs you to look at certain things in a different way. And in terms of like, I don't know, experiences where a change or a small change perhaps like ends up creating rippling effects all over a system. Well, there's plenty of them, right? In general, in a lot of cases, you see in companies, especially large companies, where they end up trying to focus on improving the parts. And then because of this effort, is a little bit anti-systemic, what tends to happen is that they obtain perhaps not the outcomes they were hoping for, and things get worse, right? So I don't know. There's millions of examples. The classic one is when you focus on measuring productivity, perhaps by counting lines of codes or number of PRs, and then like fast forward a year or two, and you see that the entire culture of the company change and people behave differently because fundamentally you create an incentive for them to do so. This doesn't introduce better productivity. If anything, gets things worse, right? And I don't know if maybe Luis, you got like counterexample or something similar. Yeah.
How many hours do we have? I mean, there's so many. The the creation of these perverse incentives. I mean, it can go either way. You can have a small change that has a positive effect on the system, or systems, because even systems are interconnected. I would just add something to what Martin wrote. Seeing the whole rather than the parts is important, but I think one important differentiation of what makes a system is that the parts are interconnected in a meaningful way. So you can look at a whole pile of sand, but it's just that it's a pile of sand. It's not necessarily a system. And each grain of sand is a component, but it's not necessarily something that's influential across the rest of the system. Where making a change there will not necessarily propagate, and so on. It could propagate. You could create an avalanche down a mountain with snow or something like that. But um, it all depends on the function and the relationships between the elements that are part of the system, and then the outward relationships to higher hierarchies of systems that you could have. And this is why this systems and subsystems are all interconnected, that you have this butterfly effects that I was talking about, where, for example, you introduce something, a change, with the best of intentions, but there are unforeseen consequences. You mentioned the changing lines of the number of lines of code written, which is a classic one from the, I don't know, 1980s or something like that. But also things that you still see a lot these days, like individual contributor performance rewards. You want to incentivize people to perform better, but you look at individual performance rather than performance as a team or uh, as part of a wider organization, which creates an incentive for people to put their own interests ahead of the team, which then causes conflicts in the team and introduces problems that could propagate even across the whole organization, which could then become dysfunctional. One that I've seen happen a lot, especially with teams that are dealing with very old code bases and they don't have a lot of confidence maintaining code, is a top-down mandate to write tests and say you have to reach this code coverage percentage, and they give you a number, like you have to have 80% of the code covered. And there's lots of ways for you to reach that number. You could write a test that exercises the code but doesn't actually test anything, doesn't assert anything, and boom, you get the 80%, but you're not actually doing anything, and you have a useless test, and you haven't actually improved. In fact, this kind of approach sometimes, especially if it's forced, if it's not the team that adopts it, if it's forced on the team, um, usually means that the team does not understand the value of tests. And because they don't understand the value of tests and why they're testing, they don't necessarily know how to test, what matters, right? And they end up writing the wrong tests, which could make the whole code base worse because now you're, for example, coupled with you have the code base coupled with the test structure. You want to refactor the code, but it breaks the test, so you don't refactor. Which then spirals out into the architecture degrading further and further and further. And at the root of all of this was a mandate done with the best of intentions to get teams to write tests. So it happens a lot. I mean, there's a lot of examples like this.
Yeah, I think like software engineering is particularly rife for examples because, as you mentioned, right, fundamentally software systems are, well, systems and fundamentally machines, right? Because there's different kind of systems as well. So machines in particular, they're made by inanimate parts, and these parts don't have their own goals, right? So as an example, you cannot create the wrong incentives in a code base because, a code base, the machine doesn't do anything on its own. Now, for developer teams are systems, but they're different kind of system, like social systems, where each member has their own goals, right? And so that's why by creating their own incentives is you're forcing them to make a choice between what's best for themselves and what's best for the company. And typically people, we all know how that choice typically goes.
Right.
And then the last element that creates such crazy effects like the one Luis was talking about is why it's called a socio-technical system, is the interaction between social systems like teams and machine systems like code bases, right? And so that's why, as an example, when developers have emotions about the state of the code base, it also ends up making things worse, and you get all this kind of crazy dynamics.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah,
I don't
makes
know. I
sense.
don't know. I don't know if machines are just machines now because with all the AI agents going on, maybe that's going to change a lot. But that still doesn't mean that machines can't be unpredictable. I mean,
Mhm.
um, uh, you work at Meta, so you know this pretty well. I mean, systems behave very unpredictable at a certain scale that they don't when you begin designing them. When you are designing for an architecture for 100 users, 1,000 users, it's not a lot of these assumed behavior is not going to hold for a million users or even more than this. Um, so it's there's a lot of, especially in a very complex system, there's a lot of unpredictability that could surprise you in the systems that you create.
Yeah. Yeah, one thing that I've noticed, which is very common across companies, is that, and I want to kind of link to the social aspect of systems, is that because it's kind of like every department lives in its own bubble. And but we can see this also on social media and when you have conversations with people in the industry. So developers are all about agile and Scrum and continuous delivery and TDD, and then you have the designers about design thinking and strategy, UX, and product managers have their own things as well. And um, it's like they think they exist in isolation. So all the optimization they do them because I mean they can improve some kind of metrics or something, but it's always in their own bubble. So
Mhm.
in your opinion, what are the main consequences of this kind of mindset and this kind of social system configuration? Let's say.
Well, I mean, I'll start and then, I mean, Luis, I'll call you in, right? Well, the main consequence is essentially like screw ups, right? Where, you know, each department is doing their absolute best, and then the sum of the parts would be great, but you're looking at the interaction of the parts, and that's not as great, right? And so, as an example, some teams might pride themselves on doing continuous delivery, and you say, okay, I release to production 50 times a day, we're all happy. And then you're like, hey, but if we're releasing major features in production without giving marketing and product folks the chance to, create the right expectations and audience and marketing campaigns, well, essentially, we're nullifying the outcomes that we would have gotten from those changes because we're not playing in sync, right? And so I guess that's a fundamental point.
Yeah,
It's
yeah,
it's it's part of the part of this is this anti-systemic way of thinking where you think about these things in isolation, right? You're improving design, you're improving engineering, but you make this assumption that they're not connected, even though rationally you know that they are and that they have to collaborate and work together. Uh, so what this ends up creating, um, so there's a more practical, well, they're all practical, but there's a couple of major consequences that where this could happen. One is the feedback loops between these entities, between these teams, let's call it, these social systems, if you will. Even if they're within the same team, and I've seen this also happen, where you have people work technically inside the same team, but they work in isolation. They don't interact regularly, and the designer does something, throws it over the fence. A day later, the developer was getting very frustrated by the designer's wild imagination. It says, "No, this is impossible to do. It's impractical. It requires me to refactor blah blah blah," and sends it back. And a day later, the designer comes up with a revision. So the feedback loops when this happens are very very long, and people are not talking together and resolving these things within minutes sometimes. I mean, I've had the pleasure of working in teams where the designers actually collaborated with and paired with the developers, the engineers, and it was a pleasure to see because they were trying out new ideas um, with live code, and they were working on live things, not a mock-up, not something on Figma. They were actually trying out new ideas and small ideas. I mean, not nothing huge, but it was pretty cool to see suggestions coming from either side about how to improve and how to make that thing happen. Um, and this also has an effect on the team's cohesion because if you have these very long feedback loops, especially if there's a lot of frustration going on, I like the resentment grows, like, and you start to blame designers, and you start to blame the product manager, and you start to blame whoever, right? Because you're not working together, you're not understanding each other's problems, which are also your problems, or should also be your problems, which is why I think a product engineer is a more fitting description for what we should be doing. Um, Caring about the product as a whole, not just about the software part or just the technical part. So it doesn't necessarily mean that I'm a designer, but it means that I also care about design and that I also care about having a proper conversation going between all parts who are involved in building this product.
Yeah, we usually hear like related to the new, the generative AI creating code for us, that code is not a bottleneck, right? So is that can we kind of explain this sentence in system thinking terms?
I mean, yeah. Uh, Let me put it this way. I wouldn't even, when I hear the word bottleneck, on one hand, yes, I do agree with the statement, and we all read the goal and we understand what it means. On the other hand, I mean, software product development is not manufacturing. This is an important point. The point is, there's a lot of focus in the industry on throughput, number of staff, productivity, right? How do you define productivity as an example, right? So because it's some sort of measure of velocity, there has to be time at the denominator, which is fine. What do you put on the top, right? What is it? Is it like stuff done in the human of time? What are we producing? Is it lines of code, right? If you analyze it for a minute, it kind of cracks down. Now, the problem in my mind is not much that writing software is the bottom, isn't the bottleneck. Yes, it's not. Like fundamentally, if we could speed up writing software by 10 times, we wouldn't be able to reach 10 times the outcomes in the unit of time. It's not even, I mean, it's laughable, right? It's not even point trying to argue for it. But the point is, I think it's even deeper. The problem is that fundamentally, this stems from an anti-systemic view of what product development is, right? Because and this also like explains the problem that Luis was talking about, which is resentment building up and friction and blaming each other, and also why in some companies design and product and engineering they collaborate, and even like other areas like marketing and sales and whatnot. And in most companies this doesn't happen. And I think like because a lot of companies start by hiring a panel of executives, and so typically, I don't know, if I were to create my own company, I might hire you, Giuseppe, and like, hey, you're the executive for product management, and Luis, you're the executive for, I don't know, sales, right? Now, fundamentally, what that message says is, hey, Giuseppe, you're going to be entirely and fully responsible for product. You hire your own people and do whatever you want. And Luis, you're the same with sales, right? And then if product doesn't go well and sales go well, you're a good boy and Giuseppe isn't, and the other way around, right? And fundamentally, this cascades down, right? Because then in turn, you would hire a VP of infrastructure and a VP or whatever. And this goes from the top all the way down to the teams where people tend to report to different hierarchies of management and have different goals and different incentives and so on. About the blame is a little bit the same because if we fundamentally believe that the outcome is the sum of the parts, and that's the belief behind splitting the responsibility across the executives, then the point is when things don't go well, I'm like, hey, I'm doing my part. Who's not doing their part? Because things aren't adding up, right? So you don't see it as, hey, we might all be doing our part well, but we're doing it in a way that doesn't really fit together, right? So it's kind of the same mindset, basically. And so for LLMs, the point being is it doesn't really matter if you write the code. The goal is not writing the code in the first place. The goal is integrating a new change into a system and then sustaining a steady stream of changes for several years. And that's the thing where when I look at LLMs, they're like, oh yeah, can you write me a Tetris game from scratch in a minute? Amazing, but that's not the job.
That's where I've seen a lot of companies begin to struggle. I've worked as a consultant for 15 years or so. And a lot of the companies I've come across, they start out very well.
Mm.
And they reach a point where the complexity builds up so much. Not just in terms of the software, but also the organization becomes so complex that they grind to a halt. Like the whole thing becomes unsustainable. And they accumulate so much, I don't know how to say technical debt, but they accumulate so many problems in the product that they're not able to improve the product any further except to fix issues. Um, and it's a lot like that. Like a lot of the issues have to do with not looking beyond your bubble, and you're stuck. You fix your stuff, but there is a systemic problem somewhere in the architecture around you as well. But because it's not yours, let other people fix it. And the other people are thinking the same thing. So nothing ever improves. So you're like it's as if you've um and I don't want to bring up I didn't want to bring up an example from manufacturing, but it's like you're building a car and someone's focused on building the fastest engine, and the other team is not looking at anything else, and they're focused on building the lightest chassis, so the car is as lightweight as possible. And then you bring the two things together, and the car flies off the road because it's too fast for its own weight. So you have a huge problem because you're not looking at the whole uh, the interactions that you don't expect to see because you're not thinking about how the whole pieces integrate with each other.
Yeah, and I guess another important factor to consider is that there are delays, right, in the job we do. So even if you write code like 10 times faster, okay, you're shipping all these features, but then you're ignoring the fact that there are people that use the system, that the software, that because they're human, they need time to adapt, to understand, and that takes a lot of time, right? Um, Most of all, for example, in I don't know, business products. So that delay, it's exactly what we need to make the product better, to make decisions. So it doesn't really matter that you just can spit codes super fast if you can't act on that feedback, and maybe it's not even arriving at feedback in a timely manner, right?
So like once again, right? And this is like my own very personal kind of opinion. The point is, I don't think that if you're, let me put it this way, if you're a software pro company, right? There's a lot of people who will swear by the importance of speed, right? Or you have to build it all, right? So imagine you're like, I don't know, Notion, right? You start from scratch, you're on the rat race. You need to do it so quickly that the competitors will never catch up with you, or Slack, the same. But then you're like, for a minute, if you look at those products, and I think like the most companies are like that, if you had to rebuild them from scratch, so imagine you do this experiment, right? You look at Notion and you want to rebuild it from scratch, exactly what it is, into a new company. It's not that much work. Now, the point is, it's not like they probably didn't become successful by working 20 times as hard as others. They just understood one or two things well that created some sort of like attractive states for their customers, and that worked, right? And remember, people have emotions. So once again, it's a whole different story. But the point is, what really matters is doing the job that your customers have for your product in a way that's optimal for them under their circumstances. This normally isn't about like building the world. So if suddenly with LLMs, even if, and I think the answer is no, but even if we were able to say accelerate software development by 10x, I mean, you're running to nowhere. The point is you still need to understand those things. That's the hard part of product development. It's not, oh, we need to just build it all.
Yeah. I think something similar happened with the Blue Sky, right? Like
Mhm.
the team was quite small. They built it quite
Yeah.
fast with not much. Yeah, it was very similar story.
And so there, exactly like Blue Sky is a really good example. There where matter is understanding your audience, right? How's your audience different from X? What do they care about? And so as an example, the policy around blocking content and people is way more advanced because it caters to an audience. It's not something that, oh yeah, if we go LLMs tomorrow, Blue Sky. You need to understand stuff, right?
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, definitely. Um, I don't know, there's a lot of bottlenecks. I don't know if customer feedback is necessarily the biggest one. It all depends on how aggressively you seek it out, because you could get quite aggressive to get that customer feedback. Sometimes, and especially in a company that is a few years going already, I mean, even writing a very minor feature can take a long while because of all the tech
Mhm.
debt in the way, and that you have to clear, and all the things that you have to change and prepare for before you release. So that there could be feedback delays everywhere. It very much depends on what product you're building, the audience as well. I mean, sometimes I said you can be quite aggressive to get feedback from customers. It depends also on the customer. I've worked on a project where the customers were judges,
Uh-huh.
and it's not like you're going to bother a judge to get feedback. More often than not, they would bother you because something wasn't working like they expected, and they would be very angry about it.
And also, just to jump on feedback, I mean, I don't know if it's related or not to system thinking, but I think it's an interesting point. I think like a lot of companies abuse this thing and the whole user research and whatnot, because fundamentally feedback's not there to tell you what to do, right? And I think a lot of companies, they kind of try to use it a little bit like if they were blind and, testing the waters. And what you probably want to use it for is to validate your assumptions, right? So you come up with a model that explains your market, your customers, their need, how your product delivers on the job that they have at their ends, and then what happens is you try stuff, and if there's a mismatch between what you're seeing and what your model would have predicted, then you gather that as feedback and adapt your model to take that into account, right? But you see in a lot of companies where there's also like, I don't know, almost like some sort of fear of making decisions and trying things because, oh, we just need to ask the users. And then the other problem is you can't ask the users what they would do because it's just not how people think. And so you say, oh, would you buy this? It's a really dumb question, but it's a popular one.
Yes, and the famous doing a demo and asking, "Did you like it?"
Yeah,
That's also a classic.
yeah, exactly.
But yeah, you can trust. So sometimes it's better that you can trust the users, but you have to know what is. You have to understand the problem. You have to understand what they're trying to do rather than what they want, because the users of your platform are also conditioned by what they work with. So the current product, they conditioned by what they've seen before in the competition. So they don't necessarily, they're not your product designers. They're not your architects. They're not you have to go to them to understand their problems, not to look for solutions. You're the one responsible for the solutions, and
Your
you're
job,
the one
yeah.
responsible for the decision making. And sometimes you'll make the wrong call. Sometimes you'll make a bad decision, you'll either overshoot or undershoot or completely miss the mark. But this is why it's important to have these very short, quick feedback cycles, because you can try one small thing with minimal risk, and if that works, then you move on and you continue to do that. Otherwise, you go back to the drawing board, but it's always a very small bet that you do every time. Um, this how this relates to systems thinking has to do with how you can predict the behavior of the system. Because if you introduce a very small change in the system, the behavior will be slightly more predictable. I'm not saying that you can 100% predict how a system will behave, because it's usually very complex, at least in our in our line of work. But the bigger the change, the bigger the unpredictability of uh, how the system will react to that change. And this is why you do these small iterations and you test and measure all the time.
Yeah. Yeah. I was wondering, in your experience, what's something that either, let's say, leadership, but also like a individual contributor can do to um, kind of make decisions as a system and not just in like in the local in the local area.
Mm, that's a good question. So I think I'm both optimistic and pessimistic about it, which is funny. I think like on the optimistic part of it, which is probably the harder one to defend, is I think like just thinking things, mapping them out, talking to people, that helps a lot, right? Because yes, it is true. Ultimately, it's the incentives created by structures or other things that will determine a lot of it. But fundamentally, it's a powerful way of looking at things. And so what happens is if you tell people, hey, there's a chance that this is going to happen because, by doing this, that's how people are going to react, and that's going to cause this, which is going to cause that, right? And what happens is sometimes people fall for it. They'll be like, hey, maybe we shouldn't do this, right? And typically it's not in your power unless you're very high up. But even then, you'd be surprised. But the point is, it's not in your power to actually change things unilaterally. But typically, by involving people and almost like educating them a little bit without really mentioning that you're educating them, things can improve. On the pessimistic side, well, most of the times it really doesn't, right? So you can try to have some success. Typically, you will find a band of people where you're gonna go to the pub and have a lot of fun talking about this stuff, but then you're still gonna crash by the wrong incentives and structures in place. Just say.
Yeah. So if we keep saying a system like at least in software development uh, as a social system, that's where the truth is, right? So it's we work as we are a bunch of humans that work together towards building a product. So talking to each other is the bare minimum. So that's good. But yeah, then there are politics as well, which are a very good part of a very important part of societies, right? So like in the real world, also
I
in our
mean,
industry, it's very similar, I guess.
the other thing I want to mention is if you find yourself in a position with any sort of influence or power, could be a product manager or an engineering manager, or it doesn't really matter. Even if you cannot change certain things because they come from the container organization, you can still try to dampen some of the wrong incentives. That's it. Definitely it's gonna help, right?
Makes
Yeah,
sense.
definitely. I mean, you're part of the system as well, so it's a matter of also understanding what kind of impact you can have. Maybe you can't make a big splash on the overall picture, but I mean, even looking at a living organism as a system, which is made of smaller systems. Like, living being is made of organs, made of cells. I mean, all it takes is one cell to become cancerous, you can kill the whole thing. So just because you're one cog in the machinery doesn't necessarily mean that you cannot have an impact. Hopefully, a more positive one than cancer.
Yeah. Yeah, that would be a funny metaphor. Like, I want to be the cancer risk company. But yeah. Cool, cool. Yeah, so I mean, this is the product engineers community. So one of the questions I love to ask is, product engineers um, are not only concerned about the technology part, but also about the product part. They really like to shape some, like, help making product decisions, or can even influence them. Um, Even thinking about the user experience and the discovery, which of course is a teamwork, but it's something that product engineers really take at their heart, and they really like to contribute with it. Um, what do you think is the impact of such um, role in our ecosystem, let's say in the software development system, compared to when you have very very specialized roles that just do one thing and care just about their own skill set?
I'm I'm gonna start with saying something perhaps a little bit controversial, which is I think it's just a baseline expectation with seniority, right? Apart from very, very few profiles which can allow themselves to be extremely specialized and perhaps look at only software, like I don't know, if you work on Linux kernel, maybe. But the point is, apart from that, if you come in at a level of experience where you're considered somewhat senior, I would take it as a baseline expectation. Otherwise, you're counterproductive de facto. And people who know anything will probably not hire you at all.
Mhm.
That's I think that's where I stand about it.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I've always been very concerned about stuff like design and user experience. And even though I don't consider myself a designer, but I do care about the topic. And it's in some way, how products affect people and markets and so on, and how we should strive to solve problems rather than build a random solution for problems that haven't been validated. And it's having this wider view is really helpful um, to get people to care, or at least start to think that it's possible to care about beyond your little bubble, right? And because you're looking out across all sorts of barriers, front end, back end, design, engineering, product engineering, etc., etc. Um, you see the gaps between um, the elements, so to speak, and because you think a lot more about the interactions of these components. You're able to warn people, say, okay, but we could be doing this better, or we're doing this wrong, or maybe there's a different way of doing the same thing in a more efficient way, etc., etc. So this really helps bring people together and start collaborating. Obviously, the more influence you have in the organization, the more effective you can be at achieving this. But it also depends, because sometimes, like I mentioned at the beginning, I mean, sometimes you have top-down mandates to write tests and so on that don't have desired effect. So you could have the big impact, but not necessarily in a positive direction.
Yeah.
For sure, you
Yeah.
have to be involved. You have to be part of that conversation, and not isolate yourself, because that's also a problem. Leadership isolating themselves from the levels below, and this is very, very common in a very complex organization where you have multiple layers of management. It's not that someone at the top needs to know necessarily, what lines of code someone wrote, but they need to care about how teams are performing. Not necessarily how they are performing specifically. I think that should be uh, um, a team decision. Teams should be able to self-organize and be the best it can be and reach out to other teams and so on. But at least care that, am I having the effect I intended when I introduced this change or this policy or whatever. And sometimes that doesn't happen. You just, throw stuff down and let people sort themselves out. And if things go sideways, then you fire the whole team, and that's it.
Yeah. Yeah, so I'd like to stop a second to just read a couple of comments from the chat. I think mainly Martin wrote something about. So I once had to spend a month or two to improve coverage to more than 90%, but at the integration test level, we had a ton of issues. So yeah, I think this is related to what Luis was telling at the beginning. Yeah, that's a classic, right? And then, sorry, my cat is covering the chat. Um, So he wrote, the way I look at this is that users' feedback is just one input into your own learning loop because your users are also limited by focusing on small parts rather than a whole. This is a very good one, actually. Yeah. So our users don't have system thinking. They have all the incentives on their own, little world. So yeah, if we just listen to them and we're just super optimizing for their own needs, and maybe it's not the need of all the users or of the business. That's a good point. Yeah, anyone in the audience any questions for Michele or Luis? You can also turn on your camera and speak. That's fine, or just write in the chat.
Don't be shy.
Don't be shy. Yeah, we're friends here.
No
Okay,
pressure, eh?
no pressure.
I wanted to add something. Wait, there's a question.
Yeah. What do you think is the best way to spread the word about system thinking? And that's a good one.
Well, I mean, these kind of chats probably help. So I think, sometimes, because, in all honesty, there are some good books and there are some really, really good YouTube videos. I think like one of the problems with like education in general is that you can always like, I don't know, help somebody get better, but they need to want it, right? So today, which is one of the paradoxes about, the information age, there's information about everything you can ever dream about, right? You can literally open the internet, Google, buy books, watch videos. And yet, what's lacking a little bit is the appetite for this thing, right? So more than talking about the solutions and, what a system is and the properties and whatnot, I think like what really helps is focusing on the problem, right? So finding examples where the existing doctrine isn't working and then trying to say, what if there was an explanation that is not being considered here? And then people get curious. And then, learning this stuff, it's easy because you can just read it and watch it, right? I think that's possibly the biggest challenge, which is trying to like wake up people to the fact that some of these big narratives, which is, hey, we just need A players, or if anyone worked 60 hours a week, we're gonna dominate our industry. It's probably a little bit of a nonsense narrative.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, it's hard.
Mm.
I'm more of a hands-on kind of guy, so I would say I would probably demonstrate system thinking rather than try to push any books or videos. I mean, I do that too, but um, demonstrate and show, that, for example, two things that seem unrelated are actually connected, and point out that something might have an impact on this other seemingly unrelated thing. Um, People might listen to me or not. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. Sometimes nothing happens. Sometimes I get to tell them, I told you so. But I think it's more effective to demonstrate than try to evangelize anything because people tend to push back on that.
Yeah. Yeah, I guess the challenge there is that, by definition, systems have delays, right? So if you want to demonstrate something, like you need to have a lot of patience because that needs to happen in the future. Maybe it's not even going to happen, right? So that's I think the challenging part. If you make a small change today, when is that going to happen, and how can you prove that what you said was right? So of course, you need that feedback that it worked, but you may give up earlier than necessary. Yeah. Okay, there is another question. Are there any visual resources that help understand system thinking better when working with leaders? Sometimes it's hard to understand complex systems or ask the right questions to figure out what's important and what has very little impact. Yeah.
So it's an interesting one. So there are some visual tools like worldly maps or causality, chains, kind of diagrams or others, feedback loops, diagrams, whatever. There are. The hard part is that nobody is gonna like automatically create it for you, right? And so the problem is, so it depends what visualize means. If visual means, say, you understand the system or think you understand it, and you want to put in visual form for others to try and understand it, then yes. If it means, hey, there's a system and I wanted to somehow derive a visual way that explains it to me, then probably not. I mean, for some systems, maybe, but in general, probably not.
Yeah. So for really complex systems, and for sufficiently complex system, you'll never understand uh, the full range of behaviors that might emerge or emanate from that system or the properties of that system. Um, uh, Sometimes measuring is really complicated. Like, for example, how do you measure quality, which is something that a lot of us care about? Like, what is what is quality? Is it the number of bugs? Is it the number of support tickets? Is it the code coverage, like we've been talking? Um, so you need to understand what you're trying to affect. Um, but even after you understand and what goes into it, what kind of interrelations and what comes out of it as well, because sometimes you have something coming out of the system that creates a reinforcing loop, which could go either way. So, for example, if you um, do TDD, for example, which is something that we do at the company. Um, and you do it properly and you're very disciplined about it, it creates a self-reinforcing loop because even people in the team who are doing it, they begin to see the value of it. People begin to think in that way, and the whole thing improves. Even the safety net improves. The thinking about the design of the architecture and the product improves. So it creates a positive feedback. But you have to understand what kinds of effects you expect. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to get them, but it's um, you might be able to map it out and show it to someone. It's probably never going to be fully complete, and you might miss some, stray effect, some butterfly that's going to fly off and cause problems elsewhere. But it's a model. I mean, models don't have to be perfect. You'd go crazy trying to have a perfect model. You'd be stuck in designing this diagram forever and ever and ever. Never act on it.
And if eventually you're right, you can say, "I told you." So yeah, it's good for your reputation, right? So Martin
It
writes,
depends. It depends on who you tell it to.
yeah. Um, Martin writes, I've seen something called current reality tree, which is useful to highlight causes and effects. It needs to be built from someone within the organization, though, who understands workflows inside the company. Okay, I never heard of it. Current reality tree. Yeah, something to look up.
Okay.
Nice. Anyone else has questions? Seems like not. Okay, I guess we are at the end of this meetup. I'm sorry that Carlos just joined. Oh, it's okay. Next time. Next time. Maybe you can be our guest.
Happy to
Um,
do so.
yeah, nice. Nice. Thank you everyone for joining. Yeah, thank you very much, Michele and Luis. It was a very interesting conversation,
Thank
full
you.
of nice insights. Yeah, and so yeah, this conversation is gonna be is recorded, so it's gonna be uploaded on YouTube if you want to see it again. I don't know if you missed anything. But yeah, thank you everyone. Have a good Friday, good weekend.
Have a good weekend.
Bye, folks.
Thank you
Enjoy.
again.
Bye bye.